We love to open GCAP with an Australian story every year, and after winning 3 AGDAs, including the Game of the Year last year, it was a no-brainer to approach Catchweight Studios' Jordan Mochi. Though studio may be a bit misleading here, Jordan is a self-taught solo indie developer with a background in history. He worked on CONSCRIPT for 7 years while teaching himself all aspects of game development at the same time. Embodying the definition of ambition, curiosity, and drive, today Jordan comes to us for a candid and grounded look into his multi-year journey with CONSCRIPT. Please welcome to the stage Jordan Mochi.
Before I start, I was sick last week, so if I make any disgusting sounds into the microphone, that's my excuse. Cool, yeah, so hey everyone, I'm Jordan Mochi, and I was a solo developer of a game called CONSCRIPT, which is essentially a World War I themed survival horror game. So think like Resident Evil, but there's no supernatural elements, and instead of zombies and monsters, the horror is the history and the war itself. So I'll quickly just show a launch trailer for the game, just so you, for those who aren't familiar with it, can check it out.
Peggy 16.
I have a rendezvous with death. At some disputed barricade. It may be he should take my hand and lead me into his dark land, and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I should pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death, on some scarred slope of battered hill. When spring comes round again this year, and the first meadow flowers appear. God knows, 'twere better to be deep, pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breast to breast, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death, at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I, to my pledged word, am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous.
So that's CONSCRIPT. And like Sav just mentioned, I made CONSCRIPT from scratch with no prior game development experience beforehand over the span of 7 years, 7 long years. And it was not only my first commercial game, but literally the first game that I've ever made in any form whatsoever. And it went on to be signed by publisher Team 17, won 3 AGDA awards, including Game of the Year, and also was nominated for a Golden Joystick Award, but came up short to Belletro, no surprise there. Can't complain about that, was to be expected. And the game also has a 90% plus positive rating on Steam, so that's really cool as well. So this talk is going to kind of be structured as a short series of chapters on each kind of phase of development throughout the years. And the scope of this talk is going to be very general because I would feel like a total phony trying to give specialist advice because I'm literally a jack of all trades, master of none. Being a solo developer is the antithesis of being a specialist. So all I can really kind of provide is kind of an honest reflection on each broader part of development from my own mostly solo perspective. And of course, don't take anything that I say as gospel or total fact. You might get the opposite advice from other indie developers. And the truth is, I was just winging it for 7 years. So yeah, these are all just my opinions gathered from my own experience. So yeah, I'll go over all this stuff here, and kind of the question that I want to kind of wrap it all up in is, should your first game be your dream game, which is what I did. Because we all kind of know that the common advice is to not do that and to finish dozens of small games before you kind of start your dream game. And I kind of just ignored that and did the opposite. So hopefully, if you're a small indie, or one day you're kind of thinking about going indie, hopefully you can take something home from this talk. So there was some controversy last year about like what is a solo developer and all that kind of stuff. So for transparency's sake, that's what I did, and that's what I didn't do. And you can kind of be the judge of whether or not I can call myself a solo developer, but I'm going to keep calling myself one. So yeah, so a little bit of a brief background on myself. I'll keep it brief, but like all of us here, I grew up playing games, and I remember just during school drawing game characters in my notebooks instead of doing maths like I should have been. And I'll just zone out all day and just imagine I'm home playing games. I'm sure we all have a similar childhood. There was this PC program back in the day called Zelda Classic, and that was essentially like a Zelda 1 level editor, and I'd spend hours on that program making dungeons and overworld maps and stuff like that. And I never really finished anything because I was young, but that was kind of the first thing that I ever remember that was sort of game development related, so that's kind of my origin story. And then I remember I also taught myself Photoshop when I was quite young, because I was just interested in graphics and graphics design. I remember having Photoshop 7 on like an old Windows 98 family PC, and I just kind of taught myself when I was young. And like, years later, Photoshop was kind of one of my main tools, so that was kind of the only prerequisite knowledge I had when going into CONSCRIPT was Photoshop and being able to do kind of rudimentary art stuff. And then so in my teen years, I kind of fell out of touch with my creativity. I think like high school just has this way of like beating your creativity out of you. That was my experience anyway. And I kind of lost that dream of being a game developer from when I was young. So I ended up kind of being a bit lost. The high school careers woman told me that I should become a diplomat. I don't even speak anyway. Yeah, so I was totally lost in high school, and I ended up going into do a BA in history and politics because that was kind of an interest that I had, but that was just because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And this was essentially just like adult daycare while I figured out what I wanted to do, because I felt so lost, and I think that's probably fairly common for like most 19, 20-year-olds, so I shouldn't, beat myself up too much. I'm a pretty anxious person, so I would always finish my uni assignments quite early, and in my second year of university, I downloaded Game Maker on a whim and just kind of started playing around with it when I didn't have an assignment due. And I chose Game Maker because it's pretty easy jumping in point compared to Unity, especially when I was coming from like literally, I didn't even know what coding was, so I had to pick a jumping in point that I could manage. And downloading Game Maker definitely kind of reactivated some of that creative energy that I felt like I lost when I was a kid. And at the time, I was playing a lot of classic survival horror games. It's one of my favorite genres. I remember playing Resident Evil 4 for the first time when I was like 12, probably too young, but that game really spoke to me. It's my favorite game of all time, and I've played it like more than 30 times. Like I know it like the back of my hand. So at the time, I was kind of having a Resident Evil binge, and I obviously also had this passion for history because I was doing a degree in history. So I came up with this idea pretty quickly about combining survival horror and history, because most horror games kind of just default to like the modern sort of setting, which was by 2017 when I started was kind of starting to feel a bit boring. So it seemed like no developer had really explored history as a setting for horror, which was strange given that if you've studied history, you know that most of history was pretty horrific. Like our ancestors were just playing survival horror games in real life constantly. So at this point, I had the basic idea of this, but I kind of struggled to hone in on a time period. And it was too early in the process to kind of commit to one. I was still kind of exploring and experimenting. And I was also still trying to learn and navigate Game Maker because I didn't even know how to code. So I was feeling very out of my depth at this point because I just had no idea what I was doing. And like when you're first learning a new skill, it's so overwhelming trying to like chart a path forward when you have all these big dreams. And the hard part is you don't know what you don't know, and that's always the most intimidating part. And I kind of learned pretty quickly that there's just no easy way through that stage. You just have to have persistence and grit whenever you're learning a new skill. So I spent months and months learning YouTube tutorials that kind of taught me the fundamentals of coding and logic in Game Maker until I could start weaning myself off them, which I think took around 10 or 11 months. So by early 2018, so that was like 1 year in the process, I had kind of a rough prototype for this top-down pixel art survival horror game. And at this point, it didn't really have an identity. Like, it was just called Project Able, and it wasn't called CONSCRIPT at this point. It just only sort of resembled CONSCRIPT in spirit. But I was just working on this whenever I could in my free time, because I was balancing uni and all that. And in this version of the game, I had this idea that you'd like time travel through different time periods, like through a hub world, where you'd go through paintings like Mario 64 and end up in like different places. So it'd be like a horror version of Mario 64 in a way. And there'd also be, at this point, there was planned to be supernatural elements like zombies and monsters and all the kind of traditional Resident Evil stuff. But I just felt like this premise really, really lacked a lot of focus. And trying to tell a cohesive story this way would have just been impossible. So I had to really hone in on one time period, like learning how to scope correctly, which is something we all struggle with. So I eventually settled on the First World War as a time period. This was kind of a concept art piece that I did early on to kind of illustrate the vibe that I wanted to go for. And I chose World War I for a few reasons. I just had a personal interest in it after listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast on World War I, after studying it at uni for a bit. And I just felt like there was always a lot of untapped potential, as World War II is always the default time period for most games that take place during a war. It's also pretty easy to tell like a generic kind of good versus evil story with World War II that a lot of games kind of require. And World War I, every war is horrific, obviously, but World War I was like uniquely horrific. There's just something about the conditions of the trenches that the soldiers had to survive in that I thought would really like lend itself well to survival horror. So, and early on, the game was going to follow like an English or an Australian soldier and have those supernatural elements, but it was also probably going to take place in either the Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Passchendaele, kind of like two iconic battles that the English and the Australians fought in. But there was a few reasons that I had to pivot to the Battle of Verdun, which, if you're not familiar, was the French fighting the Germans. And with that, I changed the protagonist to be French instead of Australian. And so the reason I did that was because I wanted to have a bit more environment variety in the game. That was important to me. And the battles that I mentioned previously wouldn't really allow for that. It was kind of all just in the trenches. And I wanted the game to have some more environment variety. So I did a bit more research. Ended up settling on Verdun because Verdun had like a lot of different forts. It had like towns. It also had the trenches, but it had a bunch of other different locations that I could use. And if you've played Resident Evil, you know that you have the mansion, which is like the iconic area, and then the game kind of splits off into different areas, and that was really important for me. And for those unfamiliar, the Battle of Verdun took place in 1916 after the German army had attempted to invade France. It turns out that the French army in the First World War prioritized style instead of function, as you can see from the images above, the left being Australian troops and the right being French troops. And this worked out really well for me because the bright blues of the uniform contrasted really nicely with the dark grays and the browns of the game, because the game was obviously going to be quite dark because it's a horror game. And the game's also very low resolution, it's pixel art, so visual clarity was like something that was really important for me. And as you can see, the blue just pops better, especially if you're playing on a Switch or like a smaller screen. And another reason I chose Verdun was because Verdun was actually known as the worst and most horrific battle in history up to that point, and it had the highest density of deaths per square meter. So thematically, it just made sense and it really worked, so I stuck with that. So I'll just talk about the art style of the game briefly. It's kind of something that I get asked about a lot. There's a lot of confusion whether it's like a 3D game or whether it's a 2D game. Game Maker's a 2D engine, so I had to kind of fake the 3D here. And all the character animations are just pre-rendered, and a lot of the visual effects, like explosions of fire, are also just pre-rendered sprites. But all the environment art, in terms of like the tile sets and the trees and everything, that's all done by hand in Photoshop. So to accomplish this style, I'd prepare the 3D model in Blender with all the animations set up, and I'd use a plugin that I found online that would output all the animations into like huge sprite sheets. Then I'd clean them up a little bit manually in Photoshop before importing them into GameMaker. And then inside GameMaker, I'd use some shaders to kind of give it a more cohesive feel. It's kind of how it ended up looking with these massive sprite sheets. You can imagine how many sprites the game has, because there's 8 different directions for the character, 8 different compass directions, all different kinds of animations with different weapons, and that's just for the main character. Then the main character has like 8 different unlockable costumes. So this was kind of an authentic workflow to games that inspired me, a lot of those old school pre-rendered games. It was authentic, but chasing authenticity does come at a cost, and that cost is your time and your brain cells. And if you are chasing this kind of style, just keep in mind it is so hard to modify things and change things because you literally have to redo every frame of every sprite. And that's just if you want to make one little change. And I remember listening to interviews with Rare about the development on Donkey Kong Country in the 90s and how it was hard to do this in the summer with their PCs because they would literally overheat trying to render out all of Donkey Kong's frames. And it's just funny, like I ended up having that same problem with CONSCRIPT. I had to like not do this in the summer because my crappy gaming laptop couldn't handle it. So I had to like time manage and do this stuff when it was cooler. And yeah, like it does give CONSCRIPT an authentic feel. It's hard to say if that trade-off was worth it though, because it did give me a lot of headaches. So if you're gonna try and do this art style, I'd probably recommend finding a more modern way to do it and just faking it. I'll talk a little bit about social media, because I was marketing the game by myself for so many years. My primary platform was X or Twitter. Can't really speak for Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. And I started very, very early. I started in January 2018, so maybe a year after I started, and 6 years before the game ended up coming out, when I was still prototyping. And I'll just show simple GIFs of game mechanics that were being implemented. Although with low-resolution horror games, like it's really difficult because the game is naturally very, very dark and atmospheric. It's just hard to convey that with short social media posts. And I remember like the first 100 followers being like such a long grind to reach. Took me years, and then the 1,000 after that was like equally difficult. And it was brutal. It was brutal. And yeah, always have whenever I was doing a social media post, like always have a call to action. I got my Steam page up very, very early, so I could always have that call to action to get people to wishlist the game on Steam, even very, very early on, like 5 years before release. And it's just really hard to market an indie horror game right now if anyone's thinking about doing that in the future. There's so many of them, and like I said, the fact that they're kind of dull and they have a muted art style, I mean dull as in visually, it makes it really, really hard to market. Especially like now in 2025 when everyone's brain is like totally fried and we all need like 5-second maximum videos with colors everywhere. Like it's so hard to market a slow, suspenseful horror game. But I did find in my particular case that like leaning into the historical aspect of the game really, really did help, because it is what set my game apart from other, kind of generic Resident Evil clones. So yeah, even if it's an uphill battle for your game and your genre doesn't translate well to social media, like really try to lean into what makes your game unique and like really play it up as much as you can, even if it's, really exaggerate it and play it up. And yeah, social media is important, but like what I've learned is that it should never be your primary focus. And I actually kind of regret spending as much time as I did marketing the game early on. Like I probably could have stepped back a bit at times. It was probably just a bit of a distraction at times. You don't want to be the person like posting and writing about your game more than you're actually working on it. So you have to find that balance there. And especially if you're making your own trailers and stuff like that, it's so much work. So maybe find what you can outsource and outsource it if you can. And obviously you want to be funneling your followers down from Twitter or Reddit or YouTube down into Discord, and obviously from Discord you want to be getting Steam wishlists. And having that Discord group as well I found really helpful, because you have that, mine was like a few thousand at launch, and having that few thousand set of like hardcore followers to really kind of rally behind you at launch I found really helpful. So going back to the development timeline, by the time 2020 came around, I had a pretty decent 1-hour demo of the game. It was pretty rough at this point, but it did still manage to capture a lot of the atmosphere of the game, and the atmosphere had always kind of been the game's strong point. And at this point in the timeline, it still had these monsters and everything, but I removed all that. I felt like it was just very generic, and it really cheapened the historical aspect of the game. Like, after all, the point of the game was that it was supposed to illustrate the horror of war, of history, so me trying to make things up and kind of put these monsters in, I just felt like it cheapened it. So from this point on, I really leaned into the historical aspect and the authenticity aspect, because I was also studying that at uni, so it was a strength that I could lean on. And at this point, I was in my final semester of uni in 2020, and then lockdowns hit, so I figured out it would be a good time to really, really try and push forward with a Kickstarter campaign to get some momentum and kind of get the first round of funding for my game. My adult daycare was about to end, so I had to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So I put together a Kickstarter campaign over a few months, and I launched it in July of 2020. It was successful and ended up raising 40,000 Australian, but to be honest, it was a really hard uphill battle for the majority of it. The money didn't really come easy. And Kickstarter is so much work, and it'll stop your development for months, so you need to plan accordingly. It's not just something you can put together in a week or two. A demo is essential. If you don't have a demo, I wouldn't bother going for a Kickstarter or any kind of crowdfunding. I can't really comprehend how people can do it without a demo. If you have previous work you can lean on, if you're an established studio, you can do that. But for me, I had nothing. I had no validity, so I had to kind of prove myself with a pretty long demo. And keep your tiers simple. Keep them really simple. Don't overcomplicate the rewards. Don't do anything physical. Only do digital things. And I wouldn't have more than 4 or 5 tiers, because that was a mistake that I made. I made my rewards. I had too many rewards, and they were a bit too complicated. So if I was to do it again, I would really simplify my Kickstarter. But apart from getting funding, which is obviously the point, the second best thing about a Kickstarter is that it'll really, really, really force you to community build, and that is super, super useful, especially when you're going into launch, and you can rally those hardcore fans. And just be honest, provide monthly updates, and just be transparent. If something's happened in your life that caused you to delay, I told them I would launch the game in 2021. It ended up being 3 years delayed, but I guess that's somewhat expected for a solo developer. But I never disappeared. I was always very, very honest, with where I was at, and provided updates. Yeah, and when you're kind of young, 35 grand after tax seems like a lot of money, but it's really not that much money. But we were in lockdown for a while, so I was able to stretch it pretty far. Wasn't long before that I kind of had to get my second round of funding. But before I get into that, I'll just touch on, I guess, a concept, in my mind. Because somewhere down the line, you're going to have to pitch your game to someone, whether it's a screen agency or a publisher or whoever. And like I said, if you have a proven track record, this is going to be easy for you. But for me, I had no validity. No one had any right to trust me, which is fair enough, because I was coming from nothing. I didn't have a portfolio. All I had was a demo, so I felt like I had to earn a lot of that validity, and the way that I kind of gamified that in my mind was to think of things like badges, like I'm collecting them. And this is just how I gamified things. So what is a badge in my mind? It could include Steam wish lists, successful crowdfunding campaigns, Discord server size, social media followers, selections in festivals and events, things like that. I was really trying to collect them along the way to prove that I meant business. Another form of a badge is media, articles, interviews, and even though traditional media is kind of less important now than it even was 5 years ago, it's good to have, but I wouldn't spend too much time chasing it. If journalists reach out to you, that's awesome. Never say no. That was kind of my motto, is I never said no to anything. But don't stress about it too much. The reach that traditional media has is unfortunately pretty low right now. Content creators, on the other hand, have a much larger audience now. So I would make the effort to reach out to them as soon as you have a demo ready. And mileage can vary with big channels like IGN and the official PlayStation Xbox channels, because they do have huge subscriber bases, but their audience can kind of be generally inactive at times. And the channels that cover indie games specifically are who you're going to want to reach out to. And there's 2 big ones that come to mind, which is one called Alpha Beta Gamer. He's definitely one of the best. This guy covers so many different indie games every day, and his audience is generally very, very engaged. He's also open to covering games multiple times. Like he uploaded like 3 or 4 different videos on different CONSCRIPT demos that I had over the course of development. And there's probably like 2 million combined views between all those videos, which was great. Made a big difference. And Splattercat Gaming is another one that I reached out to that helped. He covered CONSCRIPT like 3 times. And yeah, so you want to reach out to these more indie-focused channels if you're an indie. And then on a secondary note, after that, you want to be reaching out to the more specific channels to your genre. So yeah, the more kind of badges that you get is the way that I thought about it, then it'll really prove your worth. There's games out there that sell themselves and they don't need much marketing, but mine wasn't one of them, unfortunately, so I had to really work hard. So in between the Kickstarter and the publisher signing, I was able to remain full-time through dev grants from Vic Screen and Screen Australia. So super lucky to have these opportunities, so utilize them if you're an indie. It's obviously competitive, but if you've been collecting those badges along the way and your game shows a lot of promise, you'll be able to get some funding there and some more opportunities to push your game further. And the pitching materials for grant agency stories is very similar to what you'd need for a publisher anyway, so yeah. So, online events. So, these online digital events are the way to go for marketing. These kind of really started becoming a thing during COVID, when physical events weren't happening anymore. And Steam has their own official themed ones that are always worth doing because they always have front page featuring. But they're also getting kind of crowded these days. So you need to make sure like your Steam page is perfect and your Steam artwork is looking good and eye-catching. Steam Next Fest is obviously the one that is the highest returns, where you need to submit a demo. Make sure your demo is as polished as possible before applying to this, because you can only apply to one now, and you should be applying to the one closest to your game launch. Back 5 years ago, when I was marketing CONSCRIPT, you could get into as many as you want. I actually got into 3 Next Fest, which was really, really helpful, but unfortunately, you can only do 1 now. And obviously, different events are going to require different things, and you're going to have to manage whether or not it's worth doing it. Like, some might require a new trailer, and new trailers are very time-consuming, so you have to look at the event and see if it's going to be worth it for you. Do the time-cost analysis. Melbourne Games Week as well, if you're Victorian, is very, very good, and has had front-page featuring as well, so make sure to get into that. And for me, with no marketing experience before this, probably the single best resource that I found online was this website called howtomarketagame.com, and it's run by a guy called Chris Sikowski, and he has a lot of content about marketing games on Steam. So definitely check that out if you're kind of in a position like me where you don't know what you're doing when it comes to marketing. There's a lot of resources there that can help you. You can even find like an online spreadsheet that shows literally every Steam event coming up and if it's paid or different details about it. So check that out. So I'll quickly, this will be the last marketing related thing because marketing was such a big part of the process for me. But this is the last marketing thing that I'll talk about. Physical events, so PAX and all those kind of things. So I ended up doing 3 physical consumer events in total. I did PAX Australia twice, and I did WASD in London, which was organized through my publisher. And to be honest, from a wishlist perspective, these won't really do too much for your game. For me, doing 3 was probably overkill in hindsight. Wishlists are pretty low for these events, even if you have a good demo that people are responding to well, and even if you're handing out the business cards and you've got the QR codes and all that, which I was making sure I was doing to everyone that came past. And you might get several hundred wish lists, maybe even 1,000 max. But that's not nothing, but it's also not a lot either in the grand scheme of things. So, considering that these usually have a paid entry and are usually quite expensive, I wouldn't say it's worth it purely from a wish list perspective. If you can tee up media appointments as well, then it's more worth it because you can get some of those badges like I talked about. But all that being said, there's definitely a lot of pros to doing physical events as well. It's a great opportunity to get hands-on feedback. And you're literally watching hundreds of people play your game in real time, which is horrific and stressful, but it's very useful at the same time. Oh man, I've got stories. I won't get into that. Yeah, and just getting to interact with players as well, it's really rewarding, because if you're like me, you were kind of reclusive for all these years in your room just making your game, and then you kind of go out into the world and you show it off to all these hundreds of players, and some might be interested in your genre, some might not be. It's really valuable. And it kind of helps remind you, why you're doing this in the first place. It's easy to lose sight of that when you're kind of just isolated and stuck in your room making your game. So I think probably do at least one of these if you can. It's good for morale, and probably do it more towards the end of the project. But I probably wouldn't go more than one. I think one's good. So as kind of like, I guess, an intermission, I just want to talk about like a bit of the historical research that I did for the game, because obviously the game takes place during like a major historical event. So I did want to really treat that with like reverence and respect. And so I went to Gamescom in 2022 to try to find a publisher, and I wanted to spend some time in Verdun because Verdun is super close to Cologne. So this was definitely one of the highlights of the entire process for me. And I think it really, really took the authenticity of the game to the next level. Even though most people won't know it or realize it, like it was important for me to do it. And so I kind of want to show like some of the historical locations in the game, and then those locations as they were in 1916, and then once again as those locations are today. So that's the trenches of Verdun in 1916. You guys didn't know you were signing up for a history lecture. That's it now. So you can kind of still see the trench lines that are visible through the ground, but they're all covered in now. And there's obviously a big forest here now. That's a fort from the game that you can go into. That's it in 1916. And that's it today, all overgrown. There's another fort. There's the fort back then. And then I ended up finding it. It was a struggle because it was half buried, but there it is today. So I'll talk a little bit about publishers, because that was also a very intimidating thing for me, coming from nothing. And from what I've been hearing, securing funding from publishers is as hard now as it ever has been. It was hard enough back when I was doing it in 2022, 2023. But I've heard it's even tougher now, because the industry is pretty messed up right now, and risk-taking is low on all sides. So yeah, I don't envy anyone that's kind of pitching right now. Good luck. But if you've been kind of acquiring these badges, like I spoke about earlier, your pitch will really be bolstered. And at a certain point, you'll be undeniable. If you're in the 10,000 plus wishlist range, publishers are going to be reaching out to you, because a lot of game scouts kind of just go to SteamDB and they filter by the most wishlisted games. They just see which ones don't have publishers yet. And at 50,000 wishlists, they're going to be really, really keen to sign you, which was kind of my experience, because most of their work is already done. And when you're an up-and-coming game developer and you start getting offers from publishers, it's really exciting. A lot of them are going to make you feel really wanted, and like signing with them is going to change your life. I definitely had a few conversations like that, and it's really hard to separate the good from the bad, and when you are that young and kind of inexperienced. And this definitely like caused me a lot of stress during the process, just not knowing what the correct path was forward. And there was times where I felt really pressured as well to sign, but I just kind of kept holding off and listening to my gut until I felt that like the time was right. Like there's publishers, I'm not going to name any names, but there was ones that literally would be like, if we sign you by next week, we can get you on this, or if we do this by then, we can guarantee that. And it's just like, if anyone's guaranteeing you anything, they're trying to manipulate you. Like that's just the reality. But like, take the meetings, even if you're not 100% on the publisher, and just speak with them, get a good sense for like, who might be a fit and who might not be a fit. And don't only check a publisher's successes, because every publisher has 1 or 2 successes under their belt. Find out what like their median or average game is, because that's probably where you'll land, statistically speaking. And if a publisher has no successes, then it's like, to me that feels like money laundering. I don't know what's going on there. So yeah. I met with probably 40 or 50 publishers before signing with Team 17, so I was really making sure to get that experience talking to different publishers. And make sure you get along with your assigned producer that the publisher is going to most likely assign to you, because that is who you're going to be interacting with 24/7. They are the conduit to the rest of the publisher, and you need to be able to rely on your publisher, your producer, and then they need to be able to rely on you. Shout out to John Cartwright, who was my producer. Game Scouts are great people, super nice, and it's their job to sign you, but you won't be communicating with them after you get signed, so keep that in mind. And also the time in between a scout reaching out to you and actually signing a publishing deal is probably going to be more than 6 months. So keep that in mind. It's a lot of work. And also you might not need a publisher at the end of the day. Like I did, because I had no idea what I was doing and I needed help porting and doing all these things. I couldn't have done that by myself. But you might be in a position where you can outsource all that stuff, so yeah. So after signing with Team 17, that's where things got very, very, very intense, because milestones were agreed upon, which kind of ratchet up the pressure. But I think at that point I'd been working on the game already for like 6 years, so I kind of needed a deadline. Like it's what I really needed. Otherwise I would have just kept working on the game forever. And at this point I was kind of I was starting to feel some of the limitations of Game Maker. Mostly because of the art style and all the pre-rendered things that I was talking about before, because the texture pages were getting really, really ridiculously big, and that was kind of causing some memory issues. Obviously, it's too late to change at that point, not changing engines at that point, but like the reality is, no matter what engine you choose or no matter what tools you're using, you're going to have limitations, and you're going to come up against issues, just how it is. So at that point, I kind of just had to embrace the limitations and move forward. And I think like embracing those limitations kind of gave CONSCRIPT a certain feel that maybe it wouldn't have had if it was in Unity or something. And in my opinion, like limitations and restrictions is what makes art art. If you can just do whatever you want, in my opinion, that's not art to me. If you can just do whatever you want, you need some sort of restriction or limitation. It's kind of like, well, in my opinion, controversially, games will never be as good as they were in the 80s and 90s, because the developers back then had restrictions and they had to like implement their vision in these restrictions. And that kind of fosters its own sort of creativity when you have limitations. It's okay to ask for help. I wish I asked for help more frequently and earlier on. I probably have like some sort of like lone wolf complex or something, like some cringe thing that cost me valuable time in the long run. So it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to ask people for help. Take shortcuts wherever you can, as long as it doesn't harm the feel of the game, as long as it doesn't harm the cohesiveness of the game. Whether it be pre-made assets from the store, sound libraries, animation libraries, all that stuff. Like I use them for CONSCRIPT, but I made sure to kind of change them in my own way to make them fit the theme. So what took me by surprise in the production process in the last year was just how large the gap was between being content complete and actually launching. So timeline-wise, I think I had to deliver a build of the game that was mostly content complete, but with like a few placeholders in late November 2023, and I signed in July 2023. So then after that, I had to deliver a build, a fully content complete build in February, and by that point, I was just kind of waiting on some last-minute voice acting and like last-minute soundtrack things to come through. And then after February, QA started on both the PC and console builds. And we also had multiple rounds of localization QA across 12 different languages, and we ended up running into like some font issues with Game Maker with Asian languages that kind of forced us to do a last-minute engine update, which was stressful, but thankfully didn't really introduce any new bugs, so that was very lucky. And there was also a huge time zone difference between me in Australia, obviously in Victoria, and Team 17 in the UK. And I was kind of really worried that that would cause issues at first. But it actually worked out in the game's favor in the end, because QA could find a bunch of bugs during their workday in the UK, and they could add them to the database, and then I could kind of pick up and fix that during my workday. So it kind of ended up being this nice cycle where bugs were being fixed quite efficiently. So we had a good 5 months of QA, and that was quite intense. And this was to deliver like the final Gold Master build in June for a July release. And this was crazy. This was the hardest I probably ever will work on anything in my life. I'd wake up, like 12 to 15 hour days were pretty normal during that time. I'd wake up at like 6 a.m., go all the way to like 9 or 10 p.m., maybe an hour or two break in the middle. This was all self-inflicted. Nobody forced me to do anything. This is just me being crazy. But that's kind of what it took to release the game by the milestone that I agreed on. And for me, I couldn't really work on CONSCRIPT any longer than that. And I wasn't willing to like compromise the vision either, so I just had to work hard. And I could also like feel the gas in the tank starting to empty after so many years. So I just had to commit to it and just finally get this thing done. There's only so many like family Christmas lunches you can go to where everyone's asking you, when's the game coming out? When's the game coming out? Jordan, when's the game coming out? Next year for like 7 years. Yeah, so that was driving me a bit crazy, and yeah, it was just time to put my head down and work as hard as I could to stop that question from ever being asked again. I personally don't think crunch is avoidable if you're in a position like this, where it's your first game and you're working by yourself. If you reduce the scope of the game, you probably can avoid it and have healthy work hours, but it just wasn't something that I was willing to do because I didn't want to compromise on my vision. And there's also, definitely things you can do to reduce the mental strain. It's all just common sense stuff that like your grandmother would tell you, like making sure you're moving every day, try to get intense cardio for like 20 or 30 minutes, or even just go for a walk, just to help reset that stress battery because it's going to be overflowing. Hydration, eat healthy, but I'm not your mother, so. I think I would have fallen apart if I did neglect my health, I would have fallen apart, but I was making sure I was treating that as just as important as working on the game, because I saw them as kind of like, they had a relationship, if that makes sense. But I'll stop the health lectures. All right, critical reception. So the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process was the critic reviews. Oh, sorry. I kind of feared that the critics wouldn't get it because it's a pretty niche game. And I knew that CONSCRIPT was a game that was probably greater than the sum of its parts. If you dig down into each mechanic individually, you're going to find flaws, and I knew that. But I felt like it was definitely a game that was, better than the sum of its parts. And I just felt like the reviews would get really caught up on like the smaller details in the game. And I also knew that I probably wouldn't get any special treatment just for being a solo developer. Like, it was going to be judged the same way as any other survival horror game on the market, and I think in that year we had like Silent Hill 2 and things like that, so. Ultimately, like, my limitations as a small team in that context weren't really going to matter. And so I just had to like learn to let go of the result, because I knew that deep down, no stone was left unturned, and I worked as hard as I could. And it's like knowing that deep down really gives you a small sense of comfort, even though you're stressed. And like a funny story, I guess, the night before the review embargo, I was hanging out with my girlfriend, and we were just, to take my mind off things because I was so stressed, we were just mucking around and acting like idiots. And I ended up jumping off my couch, and I hit my head on a roof beam, and my head fully split open, and it was like bleeding everywhere. And I had to go to hospital to get my head glued shut. So if you're nervous about your game reviews, just jump off a couch and hit your head on the roof. Like, it's a great distraction. And like, by the time I got home, I didn't even care about the reviews at all. I was like, my head is fixed. My head doesn't have a hole in it. That's better. But the game did end up scoring positively with an average 8 out of 10 Metacritic. And prior to launch, Team 17 outsourced some mock reviews to journalists that both scored it an 8 out of 10. So I had a pretty rough ballpark of what to expect, and it was a relief to get a score that ended up aligning with that. So if you have the budget, I think mock reviews are pretty helpful. But ultimately though, user scores are what's important, and you can change user scores over time. So yeah, and the game would also go on to win the 3 Agdas. Golden Joystick sits at 90%, I think 91 or 92% now. Forbes' 5th best indie game. So I'm pretty happy with that. Water break. So, CONSCRIPT launched officially on July 23rd last year. And yeah, stressful time, but in practice, nothing really changed because I had to work on a patch on launch day. So yeah, there's a 99% chance you'll be having to work on a patch. So just mentally prepare for that because you're going to have to balance working on the patch, trying to pretend your game hasn't just launched, which is hard. But overall, the game launched in a good state. We had under 30 bugs in the database at the time, but there were some balance issues that some streamers picked up late in the process, so we had to address those. But apart from that, nothing catastrophic happened. It was fairly smooth sailing. And I think it's important to be present with the players as you're launching, respond to the Steam reviews, both positive and negative. It is possible to flip negative reviews, even after a patch. So if you genuinely comment on Steam reviews and thank the user for writing the review and do all that kind of stuff, you're going to foster a more kind of positive environment in the Steam review section. And we all know that that place can be not positive at times. And you're not going to be able to flip every review or change the reception of the game, but even if you can flip 4 or 5 reviews, it's worth it. It's worth being involved. And yeah, while CONSCRIPT never blew up or anything like that, the sales have been fairly steady. And in the year since launch, yeah, more than 80,000 copies have been sold across all platforms, so I'm happy with that. The publisher recouped in February, which was about 5 months after launch. And yeah, objectively speaking, CONSCRIPT did decent. It did well compared to most indie games. It didn't take the world by storm, but it didn't flop or do terribly either. I'd be lying if both myself and the publisher weren't a little underwhelmed, given we were launching with 160,000 wish lists, and that would soon balloon to 240,000 2 weeks after launch. So there was a bit of a conversion issue there. But regardless, if you compare it to most releases on Steam, it did well, especially considering it's my first ever game, so I have to cut myself some slack. We actually had the second highest sales after launch day last month, which had been 13 months after launch, because we ended up doing a bundle with Half-Life Black Mesa, which was really, really good. Given the nature of the game, it's going to be one that just sells over a long period of time. It's not going to blow up or anything. It's just going to be a slow burner in the background, which is a good thing. And the physical release was amazing. It was awesome. It was something that I'd visualized for a long time, but never underestimate how fleeting the feelings of accomplishment really are. I visualized this for so long. It was a really big motivator for me to have it in stores, especially when I signed with Team 17, and I knew that they could do that for me. Even if I knew financially, physical, there's not that much money in physicals anymore. And then it just kind of happened, and the day, I went to the shop, saw CONSCRIPT there, and the day ended, and then the next day came around, and I didn't really think about it after that. It's kind of a good lesson to learn, and I know it sounds really corny, but really corny. But the real reward is the journey along the way. But if you're in a position where you can work on your dream game full time, that's awesome. You've won. So I'll never take that for granted. Yeah, when you release a game, it's so hard to predict where it'll land as well because it's just so crowded right now. And we launched with a good amount of wish lists, and we only spent a few hours in the Steam popular upcoming tab before we were kicked off for the next round of games, next round of 10 games releasing that day. Your indie game might be the next Balatro, or it might flop, or it might end up somewhere in the middle like CONSCRIPT. That's just the reality. It's hard to predict things. But yeah, even if your game lands somewhere in the middle, that's better than most, so it's a good spot to be in. So now that I've kind of gone over everything and the whole process, do I recommend starting with your dream game? Sorry. will take some water and I'll just let that sit for a while. Look, it did work out for me, but it could have easily not worked out for me. I worked like harder than anyone could have ever worked on anything, but the timing was also right. You know, I was in my early to mid 20s, and I kind of had the least amount of responsibilities that I ever had or ever will have. So I kind of knew that was the time to do this. If you're making small games, you're incurring way less risk. You can get them out faster. And obviously the income made from a portfolio of smaller games can help bolster you when it is time to make your dream game. You have no idea how long it takes to make a game from scratch until you've shipped one. And that was something that I learned the hard way. So making a lot of smaller games is going to give you a way better idea of how long it actually takes to make games. And you'll also hopefully kind of make all your mistakes in your first few small games instead of making them all in your big game like I did. So then, you know, you can get all these mistakes out of the way, and then when it's time to like lock in for your big game, you're a bit more, you won't make those same mistakes. And, you know, all that being said, you know, this is like the logical and realistic part of my brain, you know, trying to give people advice, but like there is a more emotional part of my brain that wouldn't want to discourage anyone, you know, from taking that huge leap and putting everything on the line. And, you know, if you want to chase that dream, that's awesome. But the reality is, you know, you could spend 7 years on a game and it could flop, it could review poorly, it could review very highly and it could still flop, you know, or you could land somewhere in the middle, like CONSCRIPT did. And just know what you're getting yourself into and understand that it may not work out. And only you kind of really know if you're the kind of person that can do this sort of thing as well. Like, I think if you generally struggle with motivation and routine, it's going to be really hard making this huge game. But if you have that fire inside of you, like then who am I to say you shouldn't do it? So go for it, but know the risks. Don't look back, but know the risks. Be very comfortable with the risks. So yeah, 30 seconds left. That was my journey with CONSCRIPT. I know it was a pretty general talk. I tried to cover a bunch of different things, but I hope I hope there was something of interest there for you. And yeah.